Hello, this is a tutorial on how to draw shadows. Shadows are a product of our 3D world. And to better understand them, let's first take a gander at a couple of real-life examples. Now let's look at the different parts of a shadow. This is the cast shadow, and this is the main shadow or true shadow. And these are both the result of the lack of direct light. However, what about secondary light sources? If you look at this area underneath the sphere, you'll notice that it is lighter than this area, and that is the result of reflected light, and it comes off of the background, and it bounces off the background back onto the sphere and sends a little bit of light back into the cast shadow, but it is barely perceptible. Light also moves in waves, so the longer the shadow, the softer it will be. There are two types of shadows, hard shadows and soft shadows, and you should pay attention to these whenever you're drawing. Look at this sphere. It is an excellent example of soft shadows. There are absolutely no hard shadows on this sphere or in its shadow. But look at this Lego horse. Do you see all of these hard shadows in here? Hard shadows form whenever there is an edge. Hard shadows also form whenever there are objects closer to other objects. And it is also dependent on how strong your light source is. Now that you understand a little bit more about shadows, let's move on to drawing. And let's talk about a couple of techniques that you can use to draw shadows. What I'm showing you now is called hatching, and it is the use of one-directional lines to represent shadow. There is also something called crosshatching, which is the use of crisscrossing lines to further darken your shadows. Okay, don't be afraid to notice that the second row of lines in my crosshatching sphere don't look good. That's because they're going in a direction that doesn't register to us as realistic. This brings me to a third artistic technique that I call directional crosshatching. This technique can be used to give your objects form and texture. This technique is used to give your viewer a direction to follow on your object. If I were to use scribbles and scratches and lines going in any direction, this cube wouldn't look right to our viewers. It wouldn't give their eyes a proper direction to follow. Our viewers would be confused. Their eyes wouldn't know where to go, and it wouldn't give this object a proper form. This is something to consider whenever you're dealing with a 3D object. So let's draw a shadow from start to finish. I'm going to start with some hatching until I'm satisfied with the darkness, and I'm placing my hatching lines closer together to delete more white on my paper. Then I'm going to use some directional crosshatching to make the sphere feel more round. At this point, it's mostly just build-up, so remember to go with the grain and place your shadows wherever you see them or want them. I'm going to fill in the rest of the sphere so I can use the midtone to decide how much darker I want my shadows. Before I go too in-depth with the shadow on my sphere, I'm going to fill in my cast shadow so I can better judge how dark I want each shadow to be. Don't be afraid to push your darks. Oftentimes people misjudge their shadows and see them as lighter than they really are. But in reality, shadows can be very, very dark compared to your midtones and especially your highlights. Here the shadow on my sphere is too light compared to my cast shadow, so I'm going to make that darker. And I'm going to smooth out the edges. I'm going to show a gradient. There are no lines on this sphere. This sphere is smooth, so I'm going to make a gradual increase in darkness, a very smooth gradation. I chose to draw around my reflected light, but an eraser makes a good tool, and a lot of people like to use kneaded erasers to pick out their reflected light on their objects, and that's just fine. Remember that the reflected light is actually very dark. It is a secondary light source, and if you took that area of the reflected light and put it next to the area in the direct light, the reflected light would look very dark. So keep that in mind. Now I'm just going to go in and soften up my cast shadow. That concludes my tutorial on how to draw shadows. These techniques are very old. The fine arts masters have been using them for centuries. But that's not to say there aren't 100 different ways to draw shadows. These are the basics, and hopefully they formed a foundation for you for study and practice. If you'd like to watch any of my other videos, the annotations on the screen will take you to them. I hope you learned something, YouTube, and thank you for watching. I'll see you around.